Before cities rose from desert plains, before writing preserved human thought, before kings claimed divine right to rule, there existed only scattered settlements along two rivers. What transformed these humble beginnings into humanity's first great civilization remains one of history's most compelling questions. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved through an unforgiving landscape, creating narrow ribbons of fertility in what is now southern Iraq. Around 10,000 BCE, the last ice age released its grip on the planet. Sea levels rose, climates shifted. Hunter-gatherers who had roamed these lands for millennia faced a choice: adapt or perish. Some chose to stay. They planted seeds. They waited. They watched crops grow. This decision changed everything. If you enjoy videos like this, like and subscribe so you don't miss any more sleep stories. The earliest farmers didn't build cities overnight. They constructed small villages, simple structures of mud brick that dissolved back into earth within a generation. Yet each village represented a radical departure from nomadic life. For the first time, humans committed to a single location. They invested in land that could not move with them. They stored surplus grain in clay vessels, creating wealth that could be stolen, inherited, distributed. By 6000 BCE, settlements like Jarmo in the Zagros foothills housed perhaps 150 people. Excavations reveal stone tools, primitive pottery, and the bones of domesticated animals. Nothing suggests grandeur. Nothing hints at empire. These villagers ground grain with stone mortars, wore simple textiles, and lived lives that would have seemed familiar to their great-grandparents. But something was changing in the south, in the marshlands where the two rivers approached the Persian Gulf. The Ubaid culture emerged around 5500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, named after the archaeological site where its distinctive pottery was first identified. These people possessed skills their northern neighbors lacked. They understood irrigation. They dug canals to divert river water to fields during dry seasons, multiplying agricultural productivity. Surplus food supported larger populations. Larger populations required coordination. Coordination demanded leaders. The first temples appeared during this period. Modest structures elevated on platforms above the surrounding settlement. We can only speculate about the rituals performed within, but their architectural significance is clear. Someone organized labor to construct these buildings. Someone maintained them. Someone decided how communal resources would be allocated between practical needs and religious expression. Eridu, later remembered as the first city, began as an Ubaid settlement. 17 temple levels have been excavated there, each built atop the ruins of its predecessor, creating an artificial hill that dominated the landscape. The earliest temple measured just 12 by 15 feet. The final iteration sprawled across thousands of square feet, its walls decorated with elaborate mosaics, its chambers filled with offerings. This architectural evolution tells a story that pottery fragments cannot. Power was concentrating, resources were accumulating, social hierarchies were crystallizing into permanent structures. By 4000 BCE, true cities were emerging. Uruk, destined to become the world's first great metropolis, covered barely 50 acres. Within 1,000 years, it would sprawl across 600 acres, housing perhaps 50,000 people. No previous human settlement had approached such scale. No existing social model could govern such complexity. The Uruk period, spanning roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, witnessed transformations that would define civilization itself. Specialization accelerated. Some men worked only metal, others made only pottery. Still others administered temple estates, tracking goods that moved through increasingly complex economic networks. This division of labor generated unprecedented productivity, but it also created dependence. A potter could not eat clay vessels. A metalworker could not wear bronze tools. Everyone needed everyone else. Trade networks expanded to supply resources the alluvial plain lacked. Timber floated down from northern forests. Copper ore arrived from Anatolia. Precious stones travelled from Persia. Each transaction required record keeping. Merchants needed to track debts, inventories, shipments. Human memory proved inadequate. Around 3200 BCE, someone in Uruk pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and created the world's first writing. The earliest tablets recorded economic transactions. 29 bushels barley, kushim. We don't know if kushim was a person, a title, or a place. We know only that someone thought this information worth preserving in permanent form. Writing began as accounting, not literature. Early tablets list commodities and quantities with maddening brevity. They tell us temple administrators tracked sheep, grain, and beer with meticulous precision. They reveal nothing about what people thought, feared, or dreamed. Those insights would come later, after writing evolved beyond its utilitarian origins. The invention of writing marked the traditional boundary between prehistory and history. Between cultures we can only infer from material remains and civilizations that speak to us directly through their own words. Yet this boundary proves less sharp than historians once believed. The earliest texts illuminate economic relationships while leaving social structures in shadow. We see the machinery of temple administration without understanding the hands that operated it. Who held power in these early cities? Archaeological evidence suggests temple complexes controlled vast resources. But were priests also political leaders? Did military commanders exist separately from religious authorities? The material record provides contradictory hints. Burials show status differentiation. Some graves contain elaborate goods, while others hold nothing. Yet we find no palaces distinct from temples, no clear evidence for secular authority separate from religious institutions. This ambiguity may reflect reality. Perhaps early Mesopotamian cities blurred categories that later civilizations would separate. Perhaps the person who interceded with gods also commanded armies, allocated grain, and judged disputes. Or perhaps our sources simply preserve what temple administrators chose to record while ignoring political relationships that seem too obvious to document. The Jemdet Nasr period, named after the site where its characteristic artifacts were first identified, bridged the gap between late Uruk culture and the early dynastic period that followed. Dating roughly 3100 to 2900 BCE, this era witnessed the spread of urban culture beyond southern Mesopotamia. Cities appeared in northern regions. Writing systems adapted to new languages. Administrative techniques refined in Uruk temples diffused to distant communities. Cylinder seals became ubiquitous during this time. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate designs, could be rolled across wet clay to create distinctive impressions. They functioned as signatures, identifying individuals in an increasingly anonymous urban environment. A merchant could seal a shipment. An official could authorize a transaction. Anyone who broke a sealed container revealed the tampering through damaged impressions. The artistic sophistication of these seals reveals aesthetic sensibilities that transcended mere utility. Master carvers created miniature masterpieces, depicting religious ceremonies, mythological scenes, and daily activities with remarkable detail. A cylinder seal might show priests offering sacrifices, workers tending livestock, or legendary heroes battling monsters. These tiny artworks provide our earliest glimpses into Mesopotamian visual culture and mythological imagination. Yet for all this cultural development, we still cannot name a single individual from this period. The written sources remain stubbornly impersonal. They record institutions, not personalities. They track commodities, not events. History, as a narrative of human actions, decisions, and consequences, remains centuries in the future. Around 2900 BCE, that silence finally broke. The early dynastic period emerged from the Jemdet-Nasr transition with a fundamental change. Rulers became visible as individuals. The Sumerian king list, compiled much later but incorporating earlier traditions, begins its historical section with kings who ruled Kish after the flood. These names may be legendary rather than historical, but they represent a crucial shift in how Mesopotamians understood political authority. Kingship, the text declares, descended from heaven. This theological claim carried profound implications. Rulers governed not through personal charisma or military might alone, but through divine mandate. The gods had chosen certain individuals to maintain order, ensure justice, and lead their cities to prosperity. This ideology would dominate Mesopotamian political thought for 3,000 years, surviving the rise and fall of dynasties, the conquest of empires, and the transformation of religious beliefs. But divine mandate required demonstration. A king proved his legitimacy through military success, monumental construction, and proper religious observance. He built temples, he dug canals, he defeated enemies, he sponsored festivals. Each action reinforced his claim to rule while generating the prosperity that enabled further demonstrations of divine favor. Competition between cities intensified during the early dynastic period. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish. Each city-state pursued its own interests while claiming universal significance. Border disputes erupted into warfare. Trade rivalries sparked diplomatic crises. Population growth strained agricultural resources. The peaceful evolution of earlier centuries gave way to chronic conflict. The earliest recorded war occurred between Lagash and Umma over a fertile border region called the Guadana. The Stele of the Vultures, erected by Eannatum of Lagash around 2450 BCE, commemorates his victory with brutal imagery. The limestone monument shows soldiers marching in formation, trampling corpses beneath their feet while vultures feast on the dead. Its inscription describes divine sanction for the war, territorial boundaries established by the gods, and Umma's violation of sacred agreements. This monument reveals warfare's transformation from sporadic raiding to organized state violence. Armies marched in disciplined formations. They carried standardized weapons. They fought under royal command for political objectives. War had become an instrument of policy, and its conduct required resources only cities could provide. Military necessity drove technological innovation. Bronze weapons replaced copper implements. Body armor protected soldiers from projectiles. Chariots provided mobile platforms for elite warriors. Each advancement demanded specialized craftsmen, steady supplies of raw materials, and economic systems capable of supporting full-time soldiers who produced nothing but security. The economic burden of militarization fell heavily on agricultural populations. Farmers owed labor service to temple estates and royal projects. They paid taxes in grain, livestock, and textiles. They served in armies during campaigning season. These obligations, justified as necessary for communal defense, gradually transformed free farmers into dependent laborers, bound to land they no longer fully controlled. Debt slavery emerged as a chronic problem. Poor harvests forced farmers to borrow grain. Harsh interest rates made repayment difficult. Default meant bondage for the debtor and sometimes his family. Royal reform edicts periodically cancelled debts and freed debt slaves. But these temporary measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental structure that generated chronic indebtedness remained intact. Social stratification intensified. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic cemeteries shows widening gaps between rich and poor. Elite burials contained gold jewelry, lapis lazuli ornaments, and elaborate weapons. Common graves hold simple pottery vessels and modest tools. A few extraordinary tombs, like those discovered in Ur's royal cemetery, reveal wealth beyond anything previously imagined. The royal cemetery of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained burials that shocked the archaeological world. Queen Puabi's tomb, held elaborate gold headdresses, lapis lazuli jewelry, and dozens of human attendants who had been sacrificed to accompany their mistress into death. The artistic sophistication of these grave goods demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossibly advanced for such an early period. But the human sacrifice proved even more disturbing. Attendants had apparently drunk poison and arranged themselves in neat rows before death, creating a frozen tableau of final service. Whether they went willingly or under compulsion remains unknown. Either possibility reveals a social order where some lives counted for everything and others for nothing. These extraordinary burials raise questions that archaeology cannot definitively answer. Who were these individuals buried with such extravagance? The excavator called them kings and queens, but no contemporary texts confirm royal status. Were they priests, military commanders, merchant princes? The material remains demonstrate their power without explaining its source or nature. What we can say with certainty is that by 2500 BCE, Mesopotamian cities had developed all the characteristics that define civilization: dense populations, monumental architecture, social stratification, specialized labor, long-distance trade, writing systems, and centralized political authority. These achievements came at a cost that would grow heavier in centuries ahead. The next transformation would unify these competing city-states under a single ruler for the first time. An ambitious king from Akkad would forge an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His name was Sargon, and his conquest would reshape Mesopotamian civilization in ways both profound and permanent. But that empire's rise required more than military genius. It demanded new technologies of power, fresh ideologies of rule, and administrative innovations that could govern diverse peoples across vast distances. The groundwork for imperial governance was already being laid in the temple archives and palace workshops of competing city-states, though no one yet recognized these scattered developments as components of a coming revolution. Word count: 2,286. The city of Akkad rose somewhere in northern Babylonia, though its precise location remains lost to archaeology. No excavation has uncovered its walls or temples. We know it existed only through texts that describe its magnificence and lament its destruction. This absence haunts Mesopotamian studies like a phantom limb, a missing piece in the puzzle of empire's origins. Sargon's background story survives in later legendary accounts that mix history with myth. According to these tales, his mother was a high priestess forbidden to bear children. She placed her infant in a reed basket sealed with bitumen and set him adrift on the Euphrates. A gardener discovered the child and raised him. The young Sargon eventually entered royal service, becoming cupbearer to the king of Kish. The narrative echoes Moses, suggesting either ancient archetypes or later literary borrowing. What happened next changed everything. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon seized power in Kish, then established a new capital at Akkad. His inscriptions claim he conquered Uruk and captured its king Lugal-Zaggisi, parading him in a neckstock before the god Enlil at Nippur. This symbolic humiliation announced a new order. The old city-state system, where each urban center maintained independence under its patron deity, would give way to centralized imperial rule. Sargon's campaign swept through Sumer with unprecedented speed. His armies defeated Ur, Umma, and Lagash in rapid succession. Traditional Sumerian military tactics, built around heavily armed infantry fighting for individual city-states, couldn't counter the Akkadian composite bow and coordinated mobile forces. Technological advantage combined with strategic innovation to produce overwhelming victories. But conquest posed new problems. How does one ruler govern dozens of cities, each with distinct traditions and patron deities? The old system of divine city kingship assumed that gods chose local rulers to manage their earthly estates. What theological justification could support one man claiming authority over all these divine territories? Sargon's solution involved religious innovation disguised as traditional piety. He claimed that Enlil, supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon, had granted him dominion over all lands. Royal inscriptions declared that Enlil had given Sargon the Upper Sea and the Lower Sea, meaning the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf. This divine mandate supposedly authorized his universal rule. The claim required careful management. Sargon couldn't simply dismiss local patron deities without triggering rebellions. Instead, he positioned himself as servant to all gods, appointed by Enlil to maintain cosmic order throughout the civilized world. He installed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at creating a direct link between Akkadian royal authority and Sumerian religious institutions. Enheduanna herself became a remarkable figure. She composed hymns in Sumerian that elevated Inanna to supreme position among goddesses while linking the deity's power to Sargon's imperial authority. These weren't mere propaganda. Her compositions showed genuine literary sophistication and theological depth. They were copied and studied for centuries after her death, making Enheduanna perhaps history's first named author whose works survived. Her hymns reveal the ideological work required to sustain empire. Traditional Sumerian theology distributed divine authority among many gods, each governing their city and sphere of influence. Enheduanna's compositions created a hierarchy with Inanna at the apex, mirroring the political hierarchy with Sargon at the top. The theological restructuring justified the political transformation. Military conquest was only the beginning. Real power required administrative infrastructure that could extract resources from conquered territories and deploy them according to imperial priorities. Sargon faced challenges no Mesopotamian ruler had previously encountered. How do you collect taxes from cities hundreds of kilometers apart? How do you prevent local officials from pocketing revenue? How do you maintain armies large enough to garrison distant provinces? The Akkadian solution involved standardization. Royal inscriptions from Sargon's reign introduced uniform weights and measures across the empire. A shekel in Akkad equaled a shekel in This seemingly technical change had profound implications. Standardized measures enabled centralized accounting. Temple and palace administrators could compare revenue from different provinces, identify shortfalls, and detect embezzlement. Standardization made the empire legible to its rulers. Language policy created another unifying mechanism. Akkadian, a Semitic language fundamentally different from Sumerian, became the empire's administrative tongue. Scribes throughout the realm learned to write Akkadian in cuneiform script, creating a class of bureaucrats whose careers depended on imperial service rather than local loyalty. These officials could be transferred between provinces, carrying administrative expertise and royal authority to distant regions. But linguistic imperialism had limits. Sumerian remained the language of high culture and religious ritual. Akkadian scribes still studied Sumerian literature and copied Sumerian texts. This bilingualism characterized Mesopotamian intellectual life for the next 2 millennia. Even when Sumerian became a dead language, spoken by no one, it remained the language of scholarship and sacred knowledge. Sargon's military campaigns extended far beyond traditional Mesopotamian horizons. His inscriptions claim expeditions to the Cedar Mountain, probably the Amanus Range in Syria, and to the Silver Mountain, possibly the Taurus Range in Anatolia. These distant campaigns secured access to timber and metal, resources lacking in the southern alluvial plain. Control over trade routes became as important as control over agricultural lands. The king's grandson Naram-Sin pushed imperial ambitions even further. His inscriptions describe campaigns to the edges of the known world, defeating coalitions of rebellious cities and subduing mountain peoples. He adopted the title King of the Four Quarters, claiming sovereignty over the entire inhabited earth. More provocatively, he declared himself a god, demanding worship alongside traditional deities. This deification marked a radical break with Mesopotamian tradition. Earlier kings claimed divine selection and support, but maintained distinction between human and divine realms. Naram-Sin's self-deification suggested that exceptional human achievement could transcend normal categories, that a sufficiently powerful ruler became divine through his own accomplishments rather than merely serving existing gods. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa, where it was taken as war booty centuries later, shows the king ascending a mountain, trampling enemies underfoot while stars of divinity shine above his horned crown. The artistic composition places him larger than life, dominating the scene while his soldiers occupy supporting positions below. This visual propaganda reinforced claims of superhuman status. Such pretensions generated backlash. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian literary composition written after the empire's collapse, blamed Naram-Sin's hubris for divine punishment. According to this text, the king destroyed Enlil's temple at Nippur in a fit of rage. The outraged god summoned the Gutian hordes from the mountains to devastate Mesopotamia. The empire fell, and Akkad itself was cursed, never to rise again. Whether Naram-Sin actually destroyed Nippur's temple remains unclear. Archaeological evidence shows the temple survived his reign, though it may have suffered damage. What matters more is how later tradition remembered the empire's end. The Curse of Akkad established a narrative pattern that would recur throughout Mesopotamian history. Imperial hubris provokes divine punishment, resulting in catastrophic collapse. The Akkadian Empire's actual collapse involved complex factors that later literary tradition simplified into moral fable. Climate data shows severe drought beginning around 2200 BCE, part of a wider pattern affecting the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Reduced rainfall meant lower crop yields. Agricultural shortfalls undermined the economic foundation supporting imperial administration and military forces. Drought alone didn't destroy the empire. The administrative system that enabled centralized rule during good times became a liability during crisis. When harvests failed, farmers still owed taxes. When they couldn't pay, officials used force to collect. Desperation bred rebellion. Local authorities faced impossible choices between meeting imperial demands and maintaining social order. Many chose survival over loyalty. The Gutians, mentioned in the Curse of Akkad as divine instruments of vengeance, were probably mountain peoples who had always raided lowland settlements during times of weakness. Akkadian military forces, undermined by fiscal crisis and desertion, couldn't maintain frontier security. Raiders penetrated deeper into Mesopotamia, disrupting trade and agriculture. The empire fragmented into competing successor states, each claiming legitimacy while controlling shrinking territories. What the Akkadian Empire left behind mattered more than its political survival. It demonstrated that large-scale territorial states could exist in Mesopotamia, that diverse cities could be governed under unified administration, that military power could override traditional city-state boundaries. These lessons weren't forgotten. Every subsequent Mesopotamian empire built on Akkadian precedents, refining techniques of conquest and control while learning from Akkadian failures. The imperial bureaucracy created new social types. Professional soldiers who served for pay rather than civic obligation. Career administrators who moved between postings rather than serving their home cities. Merchants who operated across vast distances, relying on imperial infrastructure for protection and standardization. These groups developed interests distinct from traditional urban elites, rooted in temple service and local landholding. Akkadian imperial art established conventions that persisted for centuries. The victory steles composition, showing the king as larger-than-life figure dominating lesser mortals, became standard for royal monuments. Cylinder seals from the period show unprecedented attention to naturalistic detail and dynamic composition. Sculptors achieved technical mastery that later periods struggled to match. The empire's collapse didn't erase these innovations. They entered Mesopotamian cultural DNA, shaping how later societies understood power, authority, and political possibility. When new empires arose, they didn't invent from scratch. They adapted, modified, and perfected techniques first developed during the Akkadian period. After Akkad fell, Mesopotamia experienced a brief period, sometimes called the Gutian interregnum, though this label reflects Sumerian literary prejudice more than historical reality. The Gutians probably controlled limited territory in the north, while various city-states reasserted independence in the south. This decentralization allowed local traditions to resurge, particularly Sumerian cultural and political forms that Akkadian imperialism had subordinated. Gudea of Lagash exemplifies this Sumerian revival. His numerous surviving statues show him in traditional Sumerian dress, often holding architectural plans or building tools. Inscriptions describe his pious temple construction and careful observance of traditional rituals. He claimed no imperial ambitions, presenting himself as humble servant of the gods and provider for his city. This deliberate modesty contrasted sharply with Akkadian imperial bombast. Yet Gudea's inscriptions reveal continued reliance on long-distance trade networks established during the Akkadian period. His building projects required timber from the Amanus, copper from Oman, gold from Egypt, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Such extensive trade connections suggest the period's political fragmentation didn't completely disrupt commercial systems. Merchants continued operating across political boundaries, moving goods between regions that lacked formal diplomatic relations. The Sumerian revival reached its political apex with the third dynasty of Ur, established around 2112 BCE by Ur-Nammu. This dynasty created what historians call the Ur-III state, perhaps the most thoroughly documented government in ancient history. Tens of thousands of administrative tablets survive, recording everything from sheep herding to temple construction with obsessive bureaucratic precision. Ur-III administration perfected techniques of centralized control that made the Akkadian system seem almost primitive. Every aspect of economic life fell under state supervision. Workers received standardized rations, calculated according to age, sex, and job classification. Productivity quotas determined acceptable work output. Detailed records tracked labor assignments, tool distribution, and raw material consumption. This system's sophistication depended on literacy becoming truly widespread among administrators. Scribal schools proliferated, training bureaucrats in accounting techniques and standardized documentation procedures. The curriculum emphasized practical mathematics and formulaic writing over literary education. Graduates staffed provincial offices throughout the kingdom, creating an administrative class whose technical expertise sustained centralized governance. But such intensive control created brittleness. The system functioned efficiently under stable conditions but couldn't adapt to disruption. When problems arose, bureaucrats consulted precedents and applied standard procedures rather than improvising solutions. The administrative machinery that enabled unprecedented control during normal times became a liability during crisis. That crisis arrived around 2004 BCE when Amorite tribal confederations from the Syrian steppe began pressuring Mesopotamia's western frontiers. Simultaneously, Elamite kingdoms from the eastern mountains launched raids into the lowlands. The Ur-III state, caught between these pressures, collapsed with stunning rapidity. Ibisin, the last king, was captured by Elamite forces and taken to Susa as prisoner. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed shortly after these events, describes catastrophe in vivid detail. The text portrays the goddess Ningal weeping over her ruined city, while bodies decompose in the streets and surviving inhabitants flee to the countryside. Whether these descriptions record literal truth or deploy literary convention to express historical trauma, They reveal how deeply the collapse affected Mesopotamian consciousness. What followed was another period of political fragmentation, with competing dynasties controlling different regions. But the pattern was becoming clear. Empire would rise, imposing order through force and bureaucracy. Crisis would arrive through some combination of environmental stress, military pressure, and administrative failure. Collapse would fragment Mesopotamia into competing states. Then a new power would emerge to restart the cycle. Each iteration refined techniques of imperial governance while revealing new vulnerabilities. The next great empire would arise in Babylon, transforming that previously modest city into Mesopotamia's political and cultural center for the next millennium. Babylon's transformation from regional backwater to imperial capital began not through military conquest, but through patient accumulation of commercial advantage. The city occupied a strategic position where the Euphrates approached the Tigris most closely, making it a natural transshipment point for goods moving between northern and southern Mesopotamia. Merchants established warehouses there. Craftsmen set up workshops. The population grew steadily through the 19th century BCE, while more ancient cities declined. The dynasty that would make Babylon dominant emerged from Amorite tribal leadership that had settled in the region during the Ur III collapse. These newcomers integrated into Mesopotamian urban culture while maintaining tribal solidarity networks that proved politically useful. Early Babylonian kings controlled only the city and its immediate hinterland, surrounded by rival states of comparable strength. Success required diplomatic skill rather than overwhelming force. Hammurabi inherited this modest kingdom around 1792 BCE. For 3 decades he played the cautious diplomatist, forming temporary alliances, avoiding dangerous conflicts, building economic strength. His correspondence with other rulers survives, revealing a leader who understood when to compromise and when to press advantage. He waited while stronger neighbors exhausted themselves fighting each other. Then, in a series of lightning campaigns between 1764 and 1755 BCE, Hammurabi conquered virtually all of Mesopotamia. He defeated Larsa in the south, Mari in the northwest, Eshnunna in the northeast, and Assyria in the north. Suddenly, Babylon commanded an empire comparable to Sargon's. The speed of this transformation surprised contemporaries and modern historians alike. What enabled such rapid success? Military force certainly mattered, but Hammurabi's genius lay in administrative innovation. He created a system that balanced centralized authority with local autonomy, avoiding the brittleness that had doomed Ur III. Royal appointees governed major cities, but traditional local elites retained substantial power. The king intervened in provincial affairs primarily when disputes threatened order or when major projects required coordination. Hammurabi's famous law code, erected on stone monuments throughout his kingdom, exemplified this approach. The prologue claims divine authority, presenting Hammurabi as the god's chosen instrument for establishing justice. The epilogue threatens terrible curses on anyone who damages the monument or ignores its provisions. But the actual laws reveal practical concern with regulating economic relationships and resolving disputes according to clear precedents. Modern readers often focus on the code's harsh punishments, particularly the principle of equivalent retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But this principle actually limited vengeance by establishing proportionality. Previously, injury to a powerful person might trigger unlimited retaliation against the offender's entire family. Hammurabi's code restricted punishment to match the offense, with graduated penalties reflecting social status. More revealing are provisions regulating commercial transactions, agricultural contracts, and professional responsibilities. These demonstrate sophisticated understanding of economic relationships and the disputes they generated. A merchant who advances goods to a trading agent receives specified returns or documented losses. A builder whose house collapses bears responsibility proportional to the damage caused. A surgeon who saves a patient receives payment according to the patient's social rank. The code's true purpose wasn't comprehensive legislation covering every possible situation. Rather, it established principles that judges could apply when resolving disputes. It created predictability, allowing merchants and farmers to calculate risks and plan accordingly. This legal infrastructure supported the commercial expansion that made Babylon wealthy. Archaeological evidence reveals Babylon's physical transformation during Hammurabi's reign. The city expanded dramatically, with new residential districts housing immigrant populations attracted by economic opportunities. Temple complexes received lavish donations, their priesthoods becoming stakeholders in the regime's success. The royal palace grew into a vast administrative center where hundreds of scribes processed the paperwork that sustained centralized governance. But Hammurabi's empire proved as fragile as its predecessors. His son Samsu-iluna faced immediate rebellions throughout the south, where cities resented Babylonian domination. He spent his entire reign fighting to maintain his inheritance, with mixed success. Southern Mesopotamia fragmented into competing kingdoms that would remain independent for centuries. The north proved equally unstable, with Assyria quickly reasserting autonomy. What remained was a reduced Babylonian state controlling central Mesopotamia. Yet this truncated kingdom exercised cultural influence far exceeding its political power. Babylon became the standard-bearer for Mesopotamian civilization, its dialect of Akkadian the language of scholarship and diplomacy throughout the Near East. This cultural prestige would sustain Babylonian identity through centuries of political subordination. The Kassites, arriving from the Zagros Mountains around 1595 BCE after Hittite raiders sacked Babylon, established a dynasty that would rule for over 4 centuries. Despite their foreign origins, Kassite kings presented themselves as legitimate heirs to Mesopotamian tradition. They adopted Akkadian names, patronized traditional temples, and maintained scribal schools that preserved ancient literature. Their administration blended Mesopotamian bureaucratic practices with tribal governance structures. Kassite period archives reveal a society quite different from earlier Mesopotamian states. Greater states dominated the countryside, controlled by aristocratic families with hereditary privileges. Free peasants declined in number as estate agriculture absorbed independent farmers. Cities remained important but lost the dominance they had enjoyed during earlier periods. Political power shifted toward rural landholders who could mobilize military force from dependent populations. This transformation reflected broader changes in ancient Near Eastern warfare. Horses, introduced centuries earlier, now pulled light chariots that dominated battlefields. Chariot warfare required extensive training and expensive equipment, making it an aristocratic monopoly. Kings who controlled chariot forces could dominate infantry armies. The social prestige of chariot warriors translated into political influence that reshaped governance. Kassite kings managed these aristocratic factions through careful distribution of land grants and privileges. Royal inscriptions emphasize gift-giving to loyal supporters, creating networks of obligation that sustained royal authority. But this system made centralization difficult. Great families in their regional strongholds could resist royal demands when they felt their interests threatened. The Kuduru stones characteristic of Kassite administration illustrate this decentralized reality. These monuments recorded royal land grants to temples or individuals, often with elaborate divine symbols and curse formulas protecting property rights. They represent permanent alienation of royal land, creating independent power bases that weakened centralized authority. Yet they also built stakeholder support for the regime among beneficiaries grateful for royal favor. Babylonian culture during the Kassite period achieved remarkable literary and scholarly accomplishments. Scribes compiled and edited the great works of Mesopotamian literature into standardized versions. The Epic of Gilgamesh reached its classic form, Creation myths were systematized. Omen series that would influence divination for centuries received authoritative redaction. Mathematical and astronomical texts demonstrated sophisticated technical knowledge. This scholarly activity reflected conscious effort to preserve cultural heritage during a period of political fragmentation. Scribal schools attached to major temples became repositories of traditional learning. Their curricula emphasized mastery of Sumerian, by now a dead language known only to educated specialists. Students copied ancient texts, learning both language and content. The conservative pedagogy ensured accurate transmission across generations. Yet this same conservatism could stifle innovation. Scribes valued ancient authority over contemporary observation. Mathematical problems used traditional methods even when more efficient techniques existed. Medical texts prescribed treatments based on textual precedent rather than empirical testing. The weight of tradition that preserved Mesopotamian culture also limited its evolution. The collapse of Kassite Babylon around 1155 BCE resulted from Elamite invasion, the latest iteration of highland-lowland conflict that had shaped Mesopotamian history for millennia. Elamite forces sacked Babylon, carrying off the statue of Marduk, the city's patron deity. This traumatic event haunted Babylonian consciousness for generations. The statue's absence meant the god had abandoned his city, explaining and justifying the disaster. What followed was Babylon's longest period of weakness. For over a century, the city endured Elamite domination, rival dynastic claims, and Aramean tribal incursions. The documentary record thins dramatically, suggesting administrative collapse. Major temples ceased their elaborate rituals for lack of resources. The urban population declined as people fled to safer regions or returned to agricultural villages. Recovery began under the Second Dynasty of Isin, founded by Nebuchadnezzar I around 1125 BCE. His greatest achievement was recovering Marduk's statue from Elam and returning it to Babylon with elaborate ceremony. This symbolic restoration of divine favor legitimized his rule and enabled cultural revival. Temples resumed their ritual cycles. Scribal schools reopened. The economic infrastructure supporting urban civilization began functioning again. But Nebuchadnezzar's successors couldn't maintain momentum. Aramean tribal movements intensified, disrupting trade routes and agricultural production. These nomadic groups moving into Mesopotamia from the Syrian steppe didn't conquer cities so much as infiltrate the countryside. They established autonomous tribal territories that ignored royal authority. Urban centers became islands surrounded by hostile or indifferent populations. Assyria faced similar pressures, but responded more effectively. The Assyrian heartland in northern Mesopotamia occupied more defensible terrain, with mountains protecting against some incursions. Assyrian society maintained stronger military traditions than southern states. Their army evolved into a professional force rather than relying on temporary militia levies. These advantages enabled Assyria to weather the crisis and emerge as the Near East's dominant power. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire beginning in the 9th century BCE transformed the ancient Near East's political geography. Previous empires had controlled Mesopotamia and adjacent regions. Assyria would eventually dominate territory from Egypt to Iran, creating an imperial system unprecedented in scale and sophistication. Their success rested on military innovations that made them nearly invincible in open battle. Assyrian armies perfected siege warfare, developing specialized equipment and techniques for capturing fortified cities. Battering rams protected by mobile shields could breach walls previously considered impregnable. Siege towers enabled attackers to reach wall tops and engage defenders directly. Mining operations collapsed walls from below. These technologies, combined with logistical systems that sustained armies during extended sieges, made Assyrian forces capable of reducing any city given sufficient time. Psychological warfare complemented military effectiveness. Assyrian kings commissioned detailed reliefs showing conquered cities burning, populations being deported, and rebels being impaled or flayed alive. These images, displayed prominently in royal palaces, sent clear messages about resistance's futility. Royal inscriptions described atrocities in graphic detail, emphasizing the terrible fate awaiting those who defied Assyrian power. Such brutality served calculated purpose. Assyria lacked the population to garrison every conquered territory. They relied on fear to maintain control, making examples of rebels that would discourage others. Deportation policies broke up resistant populations, moving them to distant regions where they lacked local support networks. Loyal populations received relative prosperity and protection, creating incentives for cooperation. The administrative system supporting this empire achieved remarkable sophistication. A network of roads facilitated rapid communication between the capital and provincial centers. Relay stations enabled royal messengers to cross the empire in days rather than weeks. Provincial governors submitted regular reports documenting local conditions, tax collection, and potential security threats. This information flow enabled central authorities to respond quickly to emerging problems. Assyrian kings recognized that military conquest alone couldn't sustain empire. They invested heavily in economic infrastructure, building irrigation systems, establishing market towns, and protecting trade routes. Merchants received royal protection in exchange for taxes that funded military operations. This symbiotic relationship between commercial and military interests created prosperity that benefited both rulers and subjects. But Assyrian expansion created its own problems. Each conquest added territory requiring administration and defense. Garrison forces dispersed throughout the empire weakened the army available for new campaigns. Subject populations grew more numerous than ethnic Assyrians, raising questions about long-term loyalty. The system's complexity made it vulnerable to disruption if key elements failed. Babylon presented particular difficulties. The ancient city's cultural prestige exceeded its military power, but Assyrian kings couldn't simply ignore it. They needed Babylonian cooperation to legitimize their rule over southern Mesopotamia. Yet Babylon resented Assyrian domination and repeatedly rebelled, forcing costly military interventions. This problem would plague Assyria throughout its imperial period, with different kings attempting various solutions. Some Assyrian rulers tried conciliation, respecting Babylonian autonomy and supporting its temples. Others attempted direct control, installing Assyrian governors and military occupation forces. A few even declared themselves kings of Babylon, attempting to unite the titles and legitimize Assyrian rule through traditional Mesopotamian kingship. None of these approaches achieved lasting success. The fundamental problem was ideological. Assyrian imperial ideology emphasized military conquest and divine mandate to rule all lands. Babylonian ideology stressed ancient cultural superiority and religious authority. These competing visions couldn't be easily reconciled. Assyria might control Babylon militarily, but couldn't command the cultural prestige that made Babylonian identity resilient despite political subordination. This tension would ultimately contribute to Assyria's downfall and enable Babylon's final imperial flowering. The Assyrian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent during the 7th century BCE, but the seeds of its destruction were already germinating within the imperial system itself. Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE, presided over both Assyria's cultural zenith and the beginning of its military decline. His massive library at Nineveh preserved humanity's intellectual heritage, while his armies struggled to maintain control over increasingly restive subject populations. The king's dual legacy perfectly captured Assyria's fundamental contradiction. Unmatched cultural sophistication built atop a foundation of perpetual violence. Ashurbanipal's early campaigns demonstrated traditional Assyrian military excellence. His conquest of Elam eliminated a persistent rival that had supported Babylonian rebellions for generations. The systematic destruction of Elamite cities and deportation of their populations followed established patterns, but the campaign's ferocity exceeded previous standards. Assyrian forces deliberately destroyed irrigation systems, ensuring the region couldn't recover economically for decades. This scorched earth approach achieved immediate military objectives but created lasting resentment throughout the Near East. Egypt presented different challenges. The Nile kingdom's distance from Assyrian heartlands and difficult desert approaches had previously protected it from sustained military pressure. Ashurbanipal's father Esarhaddon had briefly conquered Egypt, but maintaining control proved impossible given the logistical difficulties and constant rebellions elsewhere in the empire. Ashurbanipal's campaigns temporarily reasserted Assyrian authority, but Egyptian nationalism proved resilient. Local rulers accepted Assyrian overlordship when armies were present, then reasserted independence once forces withdrew. The Babylonian problem reached crisis during Ashurbanipal's reign, when his own brother Shamash-shum-ukin, whom he'd installed as king of Babylon, led a massive rebellion. This civil war consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, while revealing the empire's fundamental instability. A king couldn't trust even his own family when Babylon's ancient prestige conflicted with Assyrian military dominance. The rebellion's suppression required 4 years of bitter fighting and left southern Mesopotamia devastated. Babylon itself endured a siege that caused mass starvation before finally surrendering. Military overextension became increasingly apparent as the 7th century progressed. Assyrian armies operated simultaneously in Egypt, Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, and Arabia. Each frontier required permanent garrison forces, while rebellions demanded rapid deployment of mobile field armies. The system worked only when central authority remained strong, and provincial governors remained loyal. Any weakness at the center invited regional commanders to pursue independent policies or subject populations to rebel. The death of Ashurbanipal around 627 BCE triggered exactly this scenario. Succession disputes weakened central authority just when the empire faced mounting external pressures. The Medes, an Iranian people who'd been coalescing into a unified kingdom in the Zagros highlands, recognized Assyria's vulnerability and began probing attacks. The Babylonians, never reconciled to Assyrian rule despite decades of military occupation, saw opportunity for independence. The Scythians, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppes, launched devastating raids that disrupted northern provinces. Assyria's provincial governors faced impossible choices. They could strip their regions of troops to support the capital, leaving their territories vulnerable to local rebellions, or they could maintain local forces while the center weakened, risking accusations of disloyalty. Many chose pragmatic accommodation with emerging powers, switching allegiance when Assyria's weakness became undeniable. This cascade of defections accelerated imperial collapse beyond what enemy military action alone could have achieved. Babylon's final rebellion began in 626 BCE when Nabopolassar, possibly a Chaldean tribal leader from southern Mesopotamia, seized power and declared independence. Unlike previous Babylonian rebellions that Assyrian armies had suppressed, this one occurred when Assyria lacked resources for effective response. Nabopolassar consolidated control over southern Mesopotamia, while Assyrian forces fought desperately on multiple fronts. The new Babylonian king demonstrated political acumen by immediately seeking alliance with the Medes, creating a coalition that could challenge Assyrian power directly. The Median king, Cyaxares, brought formidable military capabilities to this alliance. His forces had adopted cavalry tactics that gave them mobility, matching Assyrian chariot forces while requiring less logistical support. Median archers could devastate enemy formations from horseback, then withdraw before infantry could close. This tactical innovation neutralized Assyria's traditional advantages in siege warfare and heavy infantry combat. The alliance's combined forces outnumbered Assyrian armies, while operating on interior lines that simplified coordination. The fall of Assyria occurred with shocking rapidity once the empire's defensive perimeter collapsed. Ashur, the ancient religious capital, fell in 614 BCE. The city's destruction carried enormous symbolic weight, demonstrating that even the most sacred sites couldn't withstand the coalition's military power. Nineveh followed in 612 BCE after a siege that lasted only 3 months. The great city that had dominated the Near East for centuries burned so thoroughly that later Greek historians would debate whether it had ever existed. Archaeological evidence reveals destruction layers containing thousands of arrowheads testifying to the desperate final battle. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, attempted to establish a remnant kingdom at Haran in northwestern Mesopotamia, but this effort collapsed within 4 years. Egyptian forces that had previously fought against Assyria now attempted to support it, recognizing that Babylon and Media posed greater threats to Egyptian interests than a weakened Assyria. This diplomatic reversal came too late. By 609 BCE, Assyria had ceased to exist as an independent political entity, its territories divided between the victorious coalition partners. The completeness of Assyria's destruction ensured it would never revive. The Babylonians and Medes systematically demolished Assyrian cities, destroyed irrigation systems, and deported populations. They wanted to eliminate any possibility of resurgence by erasing the physical infrastructure that had supported Assyrian power. This thoroughness reflected both practical security concerns and revenge for centuries of Assyrian brutality. The fear Assyria had used to control its empire now motivated its enemies to ensure permanent elimination. Babylon's triumph over Assyria initiated what scholars term the Neo-Babylonian Empire, though Babylonian kings themselves preferred emphasizing continuity with their ancient predecessors rather than acknowledging the centuries of foreign domination that had preceded their restoration. Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II pursued systematic programs to rebuild Babylonian greatness, investing enormous resources in construction projects that would restore the city's physical grandeur while supporting the religious institutions that legitimized their rule. The Marduk temple complex received particular attention. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions describe how he rebuilt the Esagila temple and the Etemenanki ziggurat using the finest materials from throughout the empire. The ziggurat's 7 levels, each painted a different color and topped with a shrine sheathed in gold, dominated Babylon's skyline and served as a physical manifestation of Marduk's cosmic authority. The structure's base measured approximately 90 meters on each side, making it one of the largest religious buildings ever constructed in ancient Mesopotamia. The Ishtar Gate and processional way demonstrated how Babylonian builders combined religious symbolism with political propaganda. The gate's brilliant blue glazed bricks, decorated with relief sculptures of dragons and bulls representing Marduk and Adad, created visual impact that reinforced theological messages about divine support for Babylonian kingship. The processional way's walls featured similar decorative programs extending for hundreds of meters, transforming routine religious processions into spectacular displays that impressed both citizens and foreign visitors. Babylon's defensive fortifications received comparable investment. Nebuchadnezzar constructed multiple wall circuits that made the city virtually impregnable to contemporary siege techniques. The outer walls stretched for approximately 18 kilometers, enclosing an area that could support the city's population during extended sieges. Moats, towers, and fortified gates created defensive systems that discouraged attack through their sheer intimidating scale. These fortifications symbolize Babylon's determination to never again submit to foreign conquest. The Neo-Babylonian Empire's territorial extent never matched Assyria's maximum expansion, but it encompassed the wealthy core regions of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. This more compact territory proved easier to administer and defend than Assyria's sprawling dominions had been. Babylonian kings could concentrate resources on economic development and cultural projects rather than dispersing forces across distant frontiers. The empire's prosperity derived from controlling key trade routes and agricultural heartlands rather than from extracting tribute from impoverished peripheral regions. Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem in 597 BCE and again in 586 BCE demonstrated Babylonian military capabilities while creating cultural impacts that would resonate for millennia. The destruction of Solomon's temple and the deportation of Jerusalem's elite to Babylon traumatized Jewish identity, but the exile also produced crucial developments in Jewish religious thought. The absence of the temple forced reconsideration of how to maintain covenant relationship with God without traditional sacrificial worship. This theological crisis generated innovations that would shape both Judaism and Christianity. The Babylonian exile's intellectual productivity reflected the relatively tolerant conditions that deportees experienced. Unlike Assyrian deportation policies that deliberately scattered populations to prevent organized resistance, Babylonian authorities allowed deportees to maintain community structures and practice their religions. Jewish communities in Babylon developed synagogue worship, compiled and edited biblical texts, and generated theological interpretations that addressed exile's challenges. This creative adaptation to catastrophe demonstrated how cultural traditions could survive political destruction through institutional flexibility. Babylon's scholarly institutions during this period achieved remarkable sophistication in astronomy, mathematics, and literature. The astronomical diaries maintained by temple scholars documented celestial observations with unprecedented precision, while developing predictive models for planetary motion that influenced Greek astronomy. Mathematical texts demonstrated advanced computational techniques for solving complex problems involving areas, volumes, and compound interest calculations. This intellectual flowering occurred because Neo-Babylonian kings invested heavily in traditional scribal education and temple scholarship. Yet, even as Babylon reached new heights of cultural achievement, geopolitical shifts were undermining the foundations of its power. The Persian Empire emerging under Cyrus the Great represented a fundamentally different type of political organization than previous Near Eastern empires. Rather than imposing uniform administrative systems and cultural practices, Persian rule accommodated local traditions, while requiring only political loyalty and tribute payment. This flexibility made Persian dominance more acceptable to subject populations than Assyrian or Babylonian imperialism had been. Cyrus's conquest of Media in 550 BCE created a massive empire on Babylon's northeastern frontier. His subsequent campaigns against Lydia extended Persian control into Anatolia, encircling Babylonian territories with a power vastly superior in military resources. The Persian army's combination of Iranian cavalry, Median infantry, and incorporated contingents from conquered peoples created a military machine that could overwhelm traditional Near Eastern forces through sheer numerical superiority. Nabonidus, Babylon's last king, pursued religious policies that alienated the powerful Marduk priesthood at the worst possible time. His prolonged residence at the Arabian oasis of Tamar and his promotion of the moon god Sin over Marduk created theological controversy that weakened internal support for the dynasty. When Cyrus invaded in 539 BCE, significant portions of Babylon's elite welcomed Persian rule as preferable to Nabonidus's eccentric religious policies. The city surrendered without serious resistance, ending Babylonian independence. The Achaemenid Persian Empire's organization of Mesopotamia as a satrapy preserved local administrative structures and religious institutions, while incorporating the region into a much larger imperial system. Babylon remained an important city, serving periodically as a royal residence and maintaining its religious significance, but it no longer functioned as an independent political center. The Marduk priesthood continued temple operations under Persian patronage, demonstrating how religious institutions could outlast the political structures that had originally supported them. This transition from Babylonian to Persian rule marked a fundamental shift in how empires organized themselves. The Assyrian model of direct military occupation and cultural assimilation gave way to Persian administrative flexibility that allowed diverse populations to maintain local traditions. This approach proved more sustainable, enabling the Persian Empire to endure for 2 centuries until Alexander's conquests. The lessons about imperial administration that Persia learned partly through observing Assyrian and Babylonian failures would influence subsequent empires throughout history. The Anunnaki pantheon underwent significant reinterpretation during this period of political transformation. As Babylon reasserted cultural dominance, Marduk's theological supremacy received systematic elaboration in texts that positioned him as the synthesis of all divine powers. The practice of assigning Marduk the 50 names representing different aspects of cosmic authority demonstrated how Babylonian theologians adapted traditional polytheism towards something approaching henotheism, where one god absorbed the functions previously distributed among many deities. Persian administrative practice regarding local religious traditions created unprecedented opportunities for Anunnaki worship to continue under foreign rule, while simultaneously beginning its gradual transformation into something quite different from the temple-centered systems that had characterized earlier periods. The Achaemenid policy of supporting local cults while requiring acknowledgement of Persian political supremacy meant that Babylonian temples maintained their economic functions and ritual cycles, but increasingly operated as cultural institutions preserving traditional practices rather than as centers of political power that had once rivaled royal authority. The astronomical expertise concentrated in Babylonian temples gained particular value under Persian rule. Achaemenid administrators recognized that Babylonian scholars possessed unmatched knowledge of celestial phenomena and mathematical techniques for predicting astronomical events. This recognition translated into continued royal patronage for temple observatories and scribal schools that maintained traditional learning. The astronomical diaries kept by Babylonian priests during the Persian period represent the longest continuous record of celestial observations from any ancient civilization, documenting phenomena with precision that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern astronomy. The Marduk Temple at Babylon received special attention from Persian rulers who understood that supporting traditional religious institutions helped legitimize their rule over Mesopotamian populations. Cyrus's famous cylinder inscription proclaimed his restoration of damaged temples and return of cult statues to their proper homes, positioning the Persian king as the legitimate successor to earlier Mesopotamian rulers rather than as a foreign conqueror. This propaganda proved remarkably effective. Babylonian religious texts from the Persian period describe Cyrus and his successors using traditional royal titles and epithets previously reserved for native rulers. Yet beneath this surface continuity, fundamental changes were reshaping how Mesopotamians understood divine authority and cosmic order. The integration of Mesopotamia into a vast multi-ethnic empire created unprecedented exposure to foreign religious traditions and philosophical concepts. Zoroastrian dualism, with its emphasis on cosmic conflict between good and evil, influenced how some Babylonian scholars interpreted traditional myths about divine battles and primordial chaos. Persian administrative terminology and bureaucratic procedures gradually infiltrated temple administration, creating hybrid institutions that preserve traditional functions while adapting to new political realities. The Greek conquest under Alexander transformed these gradual changes into dramatic cultural upheaval that would fundamentally alter the context for Anunnaki worship. Alexander's arrival in Babylon in 331 BCE initially seemed to promise continuity. The young Macedonian king demonstrated conspicuous respect for Babylonian traditions, participating in traditional ceremonies and ordering restoration of temples damaged during previous conflicts. His dramatic death in Babylon 8 years later, possibly in the very chamber where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled, symbolized the violent collision between Greek and Mesopotamian civilizations that his conquests had initiated. The Seleucid dynasty's establishment of Greek colonial cities throughout Mesopotamia created parallel urban systems that competed with traditional temple-centered communities for population and resources. Seleucia on the Tigris, founded as a new capital, drew population away from Babylon through economic opportunities within Greek administrative hierarchies. The new city's Greek-style institutions, theatres, gymnasia, and agoras, offered alternative social spaces that challenged temples' monopoly on urban cultural life. Young Mesopotamians seeking advancement increasingly needed Greek language skills and familiarity with Hellenistic culture, making traditional temple education less relevant for social mobility. Berossus represents the most significant attempt to bridge Greek and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions during this transitional period. This Babylonian priest, writing in Greek around 290 BCE, produced a 3-volume history that translated Mesopotamian traditions for Greek audiences. His Babylonica drew extensively on cuneiform sources to present Mesopotamian civilization's achievements in forms comprehensible to Hellenistic readers. The work's fragments, preserved through later citations, reveal sophisticated efforts to identify correspondences between Mesopotamian and Greek deities, creating theological frameworks that enabled educated individuals to participate in both cultural traditions. The identification of Anunnaki with Greek gods required careful theological analysis that went beyond simple name substitutions. Marduk's equation with Zeus reflected obvious parallels in supreme cosmic authority, but also obscured the complex divine assembly structures that had characterized traditional Mesopotamian theology. Nabu's identification with Apollo created productive synthesis around shared associations with writing and prophecy, yet transformed how Mesopotamians understood their traditional deity's role. These identifications enabled cultural translation, but inevitably altered the concepts being translated. Archaeological evidence from Hellenistic period Mesopotamia reveals the material consequences of these cultural transformations. Temple construction continued, but on reduced scales, with modified architectural forms that incorporated Greek design elements. Cuneiform continued to be written, but increasingly confined to specialized religious and scholarly contexts, rather than serving as the general administrative script. Aramaic had already been displacing cuneiform for everyday purposes during the Persian period. Greek now became the language of high culture and administrative advancement, relegating cuneiform to antiquarian status. The astronomical observations that Babylonian temples continued to maintain gained new significance within Hellenistic intellectual culture. Greek astronomers recognized Babylonian superiority in observational precision and mathematical prediction, incorporating Babylonian data and techniques into their theoretical models. This scientific exchange created channels through which Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge reached Mediterranean audiences, who had little interest in the religious frameworks within which this knowledge had originally developed. The gradual separation of astronomical science from religious context represented a fundamental shift in how celestial phenomena were understood and studied. Mathematical astronomy reached its most sophisticated expression during the Seleucid period through innovations that built on centuries of accumulated observations and computational refinement. Babylonian astronomers developed predictive models for planetary motion that used sophisticated mathematical techniques to calculate future positions with remarkable accuracy. These models employed linear and quadratic equations to approximate the complex periodic variations in planetary motion, achieving predictions that often matched observed positions within a fraction of a degree. The mathematical sophistication of these methods exceeded contemporary Greek capabilities and wouldn't be surpassed until the development of Keplerian orbital mechanics in the early modern period. The preservation of this astronomical knowledge occurred through increasingly specialized scholarly communities that maintained traditional learning, while the broader social context that had originally supported temple institutions gradually dissolved. The latest dated cuneiform tablets from Babylon, produced during the 1st century CE, include astronomical texts and mathematical computations alongside copies of traditional religious compositions. This persistence demonstrates remarkable scholarly dedication to preserving ancient knowledge long after its practical relevance had diminished. Yet the fact that cuneiform literacy survived only in such specialized contexts reveals how completely Greek and Aramaic had displaced traditional Mesopotamian languages for most purposes. The transformation of Anunnaki from active deities governing cosmic affairs into subjects of antiquarian interest represented the culmination of processes that had begun with Persian conquest and accelerated under Hellenistic rule. Religious practices continued in traditional forms at major temple sites, but served increasingly to maintain cultural identity for conservative populations rather than to regulate cosmic order through rituals that integrated religious and political authority. The elaborate festivals that had once involved entire urban populations became more intimate affairs that preserved traditional ceremonies for those families maintaining ancestral religious commitments. Jewish communities in Mesopotamia developed complex relationships with Anunnaki traditions that involved both rejection and adaptation. Biblical texts composed or edited during the Babylonian exile and Persian period show clear knowledge of Mesopotamian creation myths and flood narratives, while transforming these stories to serve monotheistic theology. The Book of Genesis's creation account bears structural similarities to Enuma Elish, while fundamentally rejecting polytheistic cosmology. The Gilgamesh flood narrative's influence on the Noah story demonstrates cultural exchange even as Jewish authors adapted Mesopotamian literary traditions to express radically different theological concepts. Apocalyptic literature that flourished in Jewish communities during Hellenistic and Roman periods shows particularly strong Mesopotamian influence in its descriptions of divine councils, angelic hierarchies, and cosmic conflict. The Book of Daniel's visions of heavenly courts where divine beings determine earthly destinies parallel traditional Anunnaki assembly narratives while adapting them to serve Jewish eschatological expectations. The Book of Enoch's elaborate angelology, with its detailed classifications of divine beings and their specialized cosmic responsibilities, reflects clear structural influence from Mesopotamian divine hierarchies, while transforming these concepts to serve very different theological purposes. The Mandaean religious community that emerged in southern Mesopotamia during late antiquity preserved perhaps the most direct continuity with ancient Anunnaki traditions within their Gnostic theological framework. Mandaean texts contain creation narratives, cosmological descriptions, and ritual procedures that show clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious literature. The Ginza RBA's account of divine beings called Uthra, who govern different cosmic spheres, reflects obvious parallels to Anunnaki hierarchies, while serving Mandaean emphasis on spiritual knowledge and salvation. Mandaean ritual practices preserve technical terminology and procedural details that derive from ancient temple liturgies, demonstrating remarkable cultural continuity across millennia. The influence of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge on Hellenistic intellectual culture created indirect channels through which Anunnaki concepts reached Mediterranean audiences. Greek astronomical texts incorporated Babylonian computational methods and observational data while preserving traditional deity names for planets and stellar configurations. This scientific transmission ensured that Anunnaki nomenclature would influence Western astronomical and astrological traditions long after the collapse of Mesopotamian temple institutions. The 7-day week, ultimately derived from Mesopotamian astronomical observations of 7 visible celestial bodies, carried forward the ancient association between days and planetary deities into modern calendar systems. Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia during the 7th century CE created new contexts for preserving fragments of ancient traditions. The translation movement in Abbasid Baghdad brought together scholars from diverse backgrounds who rendered Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific texts into Arabic while also accessing indigenous Mesopotamian sources that had survived in various forms. The Banu Musa brothers' translations during the 9th century preserved Babylonian star names and constellation mythology within Arabic astronomical literature. Thabit ibn Qurra, the most famous Haranian scholar, produced translations that maintained traditional computational methods while contributing original research, advancing contemporary astronomical understanding. The Haranian community at ancient Haran represented remarkable religious continuity with ancient Mesopotamian traditions, maintaining temple worship and philosophical schools that preserved planetary theology well into the Islamic period. These scholars identified themselves as Sabians to gain recognition as legitimate religious community under Islamic law, maintaining sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge they claimed derived from ancient Mesopotamian wisdom. Their influence on medieval Islamic intellectual culture extended far beyond their small religious community through roles as translators, astronomers, and court advisors who brought ancient knowledge into contact with contemporary developments. Medical knowledge preserved in Islamic scholarly circles created another channel through which traditional wisdom reached medieval audiences. The translation of Greek medical texts that incorporated earlier Mesopotamian pharmaceutical knowledge ensured that traditional remedies and diagnostic techniques would continue influencing medical practice throughout the Islamic world. Works by Hunayn ibn Ishaq and other translators preserve detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines and surgical procedures originally developed within temple medical schools, adapted to serve Islamic urban populations rather than traditional religious communities. Magical and astrological traditions within medieval Islamic culture incorporated significant elements derived from ancient Mesopotamian practices, though transformed to serve individual rather than communal purposes. The Gayat al-Hakim, attributed to Maslama al-Majriti, contained instructions for invoking planetary spirits that showed clear relationships to traditional Anunnaki worship, including specific ritual procedures and incantations preserving ancient terminology and symbolic associations. These magical texts treated traditional deities as powerful spiritual entities contactable through appropriate rituals, maintaining essential elements of ancient practice while adapting them for private rather than public purposes. The preservation of Mesopotamian flood narratives through Jewish and Christian literary traditions created additional channels through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audiences, though significantly transformed for monotheistic theology. The Book of Enoch, preserved in various medieval manuscripts, contains accounts of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity various arts and sciences, clearly reflecting influence from traditional Anunnaki mythology while serving Jewish apocalyptic theology. These narratives preserve structural elements of ancient divine-human relationships while transforming their theological significance. Medieval Christian chronographic traditions preserved fragments of Mesopotamian historical and mythological narratives through material derived ultimately from Berossus and other Hellenistic sources. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, composed during the 12th century, contained references to antediluvian rulers and divine beings, reflecting traditional Mesopotamian king lists and mythological narratives, interpreted within Christian theological frameworks emphasizing divine providence and human salvation. These chronographic works preserve traditional chronological data and narrative structures, while adapting them to serve Christian historical purposes. The architectural influence of Mesopotamian traditions on medieval Islamic religious and secular buildings created visual channels through which traditional symbolic associations continued influencing cultural expression. Step tower designs in medieval Islamic architecture reflected ancient ziggurat construction influence, while decorative programs incorporating astronomical and astrological imagery maintained traditional associations between architectural space and cosmic order. The Dome of the Rock, constructed during the late 7th century, featured decorative elements showing clear Mesopotamian artistic influence, including geometric patterns and celestial imagery preserving traditional symbolic associations while serving new religious purposes. Mathematical knowledge preserved in medieval Islamic scholarly circles ensured that computational techniques originally developed for temple administration and astronomical calculation would continue influencing scientific and commercial practice. Works by al-Khwarizmi and other early Islamic mathematicians incorporated methods ultimately derived from Babylonian mathematical texts, including sophisticated techniques for solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest originally developed for temple economic administration. These mathematical traditions maintained continuity with ancient scholarly practices, while adapting them for medieval Islamic urban civilization. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian source materials began with Georg Friedrich Grotefend's breakthrough decipherment of cuneiform in 1802. His success with Old Persian inscriptions established foundations for all subsequent cuneiform studies. Henry Rawlinson's meticulous copying of the Behistun inscription during the 1840s provided extensive bilingual texts, enabling systematic comparison between known Old Persian and unknown Akkadian equivalents, accelerating the decipherment process dramatically. The British Museum's acquisition of Austin Henry Layard's discoveries from Nineveh transformed European understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization and provided the first substantial collection of cuneiform tablets containing mythological and religious texts. Layard's excavations at Kuyunjik, the site of ancient Nineveh, between 1845 and 1851, uncovered the palace library of Ashurbanipal, containing over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments, representing the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian literature ever assembled in antiquity. The library's systematic organization, with texts arranged by subject matter and cross-referenced through detailed catalogues, provided modern scholars with unprecedented access to the full range of Mesopotamian intellectual achievement. George Smith's dramatic announcement in 1872 that he had discovered an account of the biblical flood among the Nineveh tablets created international sensation and demonstrated the immediate relevance of cuneiform studies for understanding ancient history and religious traditions. Smith's identification of the flood narrative within what would later be recognized as the Epic of Gilgamesh marked the first recovery of a complete Anunnaki-related mythological composition, providing concrete evidence for the sophisticated theological and literary traditions that had developed in ancient Mesopotamia. His public lecture to the Society of Biblical Archaeology drew overflow crowds and newspaper coverage that brought cuneiform scholarship to popular attention for the first time. The subsequent identification of multiple flood accounts, including the more complete version preserved in the Atrahasis epic, revealed the central importance of divine judgment narratives within Mesopotamian religious thought, and provided scholars with detailed information about Anunnaki theology and cosmic governance. Smith's continued work on the Nineveh tablets yielded additional mythological compositions, including creation accounts and divine genealogies that illuminated the complex relationships between different members of the Anunnaki pantheon. His premature death in 1876, while searching for additional flood tablet fragments in Syria, represented a significant loss to the emerging field of Assyriology, but his discoveries had already established the fundamental importance of Mesopotamian literature for understanding ancient religious and cultural development. German excavations at Babylon, initiated by Robert Koldewey in 1899 and continuing for 18 years, provided the first systematic archaeological investigation of a major Mesopotamian religious center and yielded extensive architectural and textual evidence for Anunnaki worship practices. Koldewey's meticulous documentation of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the foundations of the great ziggurat at Etemenanke revealed the massive scale of resources devoted to divine service and the sophisticated engineering techniques employed in temple construction. The excavation's recovery of thousands of cuneiform tablets from residential and commercial contexts demonstrated how deeply religious concepts penetrated daily life in Babylonian society. Discovery of the Enuma Elish creation, epic among the Babylon tablets, provided scholars with the most comprehensive account of Marduk's rise to supreme authority within the Anunnaki hierarchy, and revealed the sophisticated theological arguments that Babylonian scholars had developed to justify their city's political dominance. The epic's detailed description of primordial chaos, divine conflict, and cosmic organization offered unprecedented insight into Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, while demonstrating the literary sophistication that characterized mature Babylonian religious composition. The text's 7 tablets, each containing approximately 150 lines of carefully structured poetry, represented one of the longest and most complex literary works recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley's excavations at between 1922 and 1934 revolutionized understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization and provided dramatic evidence for the wealth and sophistication of Sumerian religious institutions. Discovery of the royal cemetery, with its elaborate burial goods and evidence for human sacrifice accompanying royal interments, demonstrated the extraordinary resources that early Mesopotamian societies devoted to ensuring proper relationships between earthly rulers and divine authorities. The cemetery's most spectacular find, the burial of Queen Puabi with her full retinue of attendants, revealed the extent to which Sumerian concepts of divine kingship required elaborate ritual procedures that maintained cosmic order through royal death and resurrection. Woolley's identification of flood deposits at multiple levels within the excavation provided archaeological evidence that supported the historical basis for Mesopotamian flood narratives, though the localized nature of these deposits indicated that the Great Flood reflected regional rather than global catastrophic events. The excavation's recovery of votive objects, cylinder seals, and architectural remains from the early dynastic period illuminated the development of Sumerian religious art and temple architecture, while cuneiform tablets from later periods documented the continued importance of as a center for lunar worship and astronomical observation throughout Mesopotamian history. The joint expedition to Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania and other institutions, beginning in 1888, provided the first systematic exploration of Mesopotamia's most important religious center and yielded the largest collection of Sumerian literary and religious texts ever discovered. Excavation of the Enlil temple complex revealed the architectural evolution of Mesopotamian religious construction over more than 3 millennia, while recovery of over 50,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from the temple archives provided unprecedented documentation of Sumerian religious practices, administrative procedures, and literary traditions. Samuel Noah Kramer's lifelong dedication to translating and interpreting the Nippur tablets revolutionized scholarly understanding of Sumerian civilization and established the fundamental importance of Sumerian religious thought for all subsequent Mesopotamian cultural development. Kramer's identification of numerous firsts in human civilization among the Sumerian texts, including the first literary compositions, the first historical records, and the first systematic theological speculation, demonstrated the foundational role that Sumerian culture had played in human intellectual development. His translation of Sumerian hymns, myths, and epic narratives revealed the sophisticated literary techniques and complex theological concepts that characterized mature Sumerian religious thought. Kramer's work on Sumerian creation myths, including the composition known as the Debate Between Grain and Sheep, illuminated the practical concerns that underlay Mesopotamian theological speculation and demonstrated how religious narratives served to explain and justify the agricultural and pastoral activities that sustained urban civilization. His translation of texts describing the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi provided detailed information about ritual practices that renewed divine authority and ensured agricultural fertility, while his work on Sumerian flood narratives revealed the theological tensions that had led to divine decisions to destroy and recreate human civilization. Thorkild Jakobsson's comparative analysis of Mesopotamian religious development provided the theoretical framework that enabled scholars to understand the evolution of Anunnaki theology from its earliest Sumerian origins through its final transformation during the Hellenistic period. Jakobsson's identification of distinct phases in Mesopotamian religious thought, from the early democracy of the gods through the later emphasis on individual divine supremacy, explained how changing political and social conditions had influenced theological development, while maintaining essential continuity in basic religious concepts. Jacobson's detailed analysis of Mesopotamian creation myths revealed the sophisticated political metaphors that underlay apparently simple mythological narratives, demonstrating how stories about divine conflicts and cosmic organization reflected contemporary concerns about earthly governance and social order. His work on the Atrahasis epic illuminated the economic and demographic pressures that had shaped Mesopotamian thinking about divine-human relationships, while his analysis of the Enuma Elish revealed the theological innovations that had enabled Babylonian scholars to adapt traditional religious concepts to serve imperial political requirements. Discovery of the library at Sultan Tepe in southeastern Turkey during excavations conducted by Seton Lloyd and Nuri Gökçe in the 1950s provided scholars with additional copies of major Mesopotamian literary works and revealed the extent to which traditional religious texts had been preserved and studied in provincial centers throughout the Assyrian Empire. The library's collection of canonical literary works, including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic and various Anunnaki hymns, demonstrated the systematic efforts that Assyrian scholars had made to preserve and standardize Mesopotamian religious literature. The Sultan Tepe tablets included commentaries and scholarly analyses of classical texts that revealed the sophisticated interpretive techniques that ancient scholars had developed for understanding complex mythological and theological concepts. These commentaries provided modern scholars with ancient explanations of obscure references and technical terminology, enabling more accurate translation and interpretation of difficult passages in major literary works. The library's preservation of both canonical texts and scholarly commentaries demonstrated the continuity of intellectual tradition that had maintained Mesopotamian religious and literary culture across multiple centuries of political upheaval. French excavations at Mari, conducted by André Parrot, beginning in 1933, uncovered a major administrative center from the Old Babylonian period and provided extensive documentation of religious practices and political relationships during a crucial period of Mesopotamian history. The palace archives at Mari contained over 25,000 cuneiform tablets that documented diplomatic correspondence, administrative procedures, and religious activities that illuminated the practical operation of divine kingship and temple administration during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The Mari letters included detailed accounts of prophetic activities and divine communication that revealed how Mesopotamian rulers maintained relationships with patron deities and sought divine guidance for political and military decisions. These texts provided concrete evidence for the practical operation of theological concepts that had previously been known primarily through literary and mythological sources, demonstrating how beliefs about divine authority translated into actual political and administrative procedures. Recovery of Akkadian literary texts from various sites throughout Mesopotamia enabled scholars to trace the development of Anunnaki mythology through different periods and regions, revealing both continuity and innovation in religious thought across more than 2 millennia. Identification of multiple versions of major compositions, including various recensions of the Gilgamesh epic and different traditions regarding creation and flood narratives, demonstrated the dynamic character of Mesopotamian religious literature and the ongoing efforts that ancient scholars had made to adapt traditional stories to contemporary concerns. Archaeological investigations at Eridu, conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd during the 1940s and 1950s, provided crucial evidence for the earliest development of Mesopotamian religious architecture and confirmed the site's traditional identification as the first city established by the gods. The excavation revealed 17 successive temple levels, dating from the Ubaid period through the Neo-Babylonian era, documenting the continuous religious significance of the site over more than 4 millennia. The earliest temple levels showed sophisticated architectural planning that established design principles later adopted throughout Mesopotamia, while votive objects and architectural features demonstrated the early development of religious concepts that would later be elaborated in complex theological systems. Continuing discovery and publication of cuneiform texts from museum collections and new excavations has provided scholars with an ever-expanding corpus of primary sources for understanding Anunnaki theology and Mesopotamian religious practices. Major text editions, including the ongoing Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, have made possible increasingly sophisticated analysis of religious terminology and theological concepts, while improved understanding of Mesopotamian historical development has enabled more accurate contextualization of religious texts within their original cultural and political settings. Modern archaeological techniques, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey, have identified hundreds of previously unknown Mesopotamian sites and provided new opportunities for understanding the geographical distribution and regional variation of Anunnaki worship. These technological advances have enabled archaeologists to investigate sites that were previously inaccessible while minimizing damage to fragile archaeological remains, ensuring that future generations of scholars will have access to well-preserved evidence for understanding ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Integration of archaeological evidence with textual sources has created increasingly sophisticated understanding of how Anunnaki theology developed within specific historical and cultural contexts, while comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern religious traditions has illuminated the distinctive characteristics of Mesopotamian religious thought. This multidisciplinary approach has revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while demonstrating its fundamental importance for understanding the development of human religious and intellectual culture. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian textual and archaeological evidence throughout the 19th and 20th centuries established a solid academic foundation for understanding the historical role of the Anunnaki within ancient Near Eastern civilization. Contemporary scholarly consensus recognizes these deities as central figures in the world's earliest urban religious systems, representing sophisticated theological concepts that governed cosmic order, political legitimacy, and social organization throughout 3 millennia of Mesopotamian history. Leading Assyriologists, including Jeremy Black, Andrew George, and Mark van der Meerup, have demonstrated through careful textual analysis and archaeological correlation that the Anunnaki functioned as administrative deities whose authority encompassed both celestial phenomena and terrestrial governance, creating integrated systems of divine kingship that sustained the world's first complex urban societies. Modern academic interpretation emphasizes the Anunnaki's role as patron deities of specific city-states, with individual gods like Enlil at Nippur, Marduk at Babylon, and Inanna at Uruk, serving as divine rulers whose earthly temples functioned as comprehensive administrative centers managing agricultural production, craft specialization, and long-distance trade networks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Girsu, Nippur, and Ur reveals the massive economic infrastructure required to support these religious institutions, with temple complexes employing thousands of workers and controlling vast agricultural estates that generated the surplus wealth necessary for monumental construction projects and elaborate ritual cycles. The theological sophistication of Anunnaki worship emerges clearly from comparative analysis of creation myths, flood narratives, and divine genealogies preserved in cuneiform literature spanning from early dynastic Sumerian compositions through Neo-Babylonian scholarly commentaries. These texts reveal systematic theological thinking that addressed fundamental questions about cosmic origins, divine authority, human purpose, and moral order through complex mythological narratives that served both religious and political functions within Mesopotamian society. The Atrahasis epic's account of human creation as divine laborers, the Enuma Elish's justification of Babylonian political supremacy through Marduk's cosmic victory, and the various flood narratives' exploration of divine justice demons trait the intellectual rigor that characterized mature Mesopotamian religious thought. Academic research has also illuminated the historical development of Anunnaki theology through successive periods of political and cultural change, revealing how these religious concepts adapted to serve different social needs while maintaining essential continuity across millennia of historical transformation. The evolution from early Sumerian concepts of divine democracy through later Babylonian emphasis on monarchical divine authority reflects changing political realities, while the integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki hierarchies during periods of cultural contact demonstrates the flexibility that enabled these religious traditions to survive conquest and demographic change. However, the academic understanding of Anunnaki as historical religious phenomena has been overshadowed in popular culture by alternative interpretations that treat these deities as extraterrestrial visitors who influenced early human civilization through advanced technology and genetic manipulation. These theories, popularized primarily through the works of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Erich von Däniken, and more recently Ancient Aliens television programming, propose that Sumerian texts describing divine activities should be understood as literal accounts of alien intervention rather than mythological narratives expressing religious and political concepts. Sitchin's translation and interpretation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, beginning with his 1976 publication, The 12th Planet, claimed to reveal evidence for an additional planet called Nibiru, whose inhabitants, the Anunnaki, traveled to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their home planet's atmospheric maintenance. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these extraterrestrial beings genetically modified existing hominid species to create modern humans as a slave labor force, establishing the first human civilizations in Mesopotamia before departing Earth with promises to return during future planetary alignments. Sitchin's theories gained substantial popular following through their presentation in accessible language that promised to reveal hidden truths about human origins while explaining the rapid development of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. His interpretation of cuneiform texts emphasized passages describing divine beings descending from heaven, teaching humans various technologies, and possessing powers that seem to exceed normal human capabilities. The author's background in economics and journalism, combined with his claimed expertise in ancient languages, lent apparent credibility to his interpretations among audiences lacking specialized knowledge of Mesopotamian studies. The ancient astronaut hypothesis expanded beyond Sitchin's specific interpretations through the work of authors like von Däniken, whose Chariots of the Gods proposed that various ancient monuments and artifacts worldwide provided evidence for extraterrestrial visitation. Von Däniken's approach emphasized visual evidence, including architectural achievements that seemed to exceed ancient technological capabilities, artistic representations that resembled modern aircraft or astronauts, and mythological narratives from multiple cultures describing divine beings with advanced powers and technologies. The popularity of these alternative theories reflects broader cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life and dissatisfaction with conventional academic explanations for the rapid development of human civilization during the Neolithic Revolution. The ancient astronaut hypothesis offers seemingly simple solutions to complex historical questions while appealing to contemporary scientific concepts about space travel and genetic engineering that make alien intervention appear plausible within modern technological frameworks. Professional Assyriologists and archaeologists have consistently rejected these alternative interpretations through detailed analysis of the linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence that contradicts extraterrestrial visitation theories. Michael Heiser's comprehensive critique of Sitchin's translations in The Unseen Realm demonstrates numerous errors in cuneiform reading and interpretation that undermine the foundation for ancient astronaut claims, while Irving Finkel's analysis of Mesopotamian flood narratives in the Ark before Noah reveals the complex literary and theological development that produced these compositions over centuries of cultural evolution. The archaeological record provides no evidence for the advanced technologies that would have been necessary for interplanetary travel during ancient periods, while the gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization through successive cultural phases contradicts claims about sudden technological advancement through alien intervention. Excavations at sites like Tel Essawan, Chogamami, and early Uruk reveal the incremental development of agricultural techniques, craft specialization, and urban organization that produce the complex societies documented in later historical periods. Despite academic rejection, ancient astronaut theories have profoundly influenced popular culture through their incorporation into science fiction literature, television programming, and internet-based alternative history communities. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which has produced over 200 episodes since 2009, presents these theories as legitimate scientific hypotheses worthy of serious consideration. Featuring interviews with proponents alongside dramatic reenactments and computer-generated imagery, creates compelling visual narratives supporting extraterrestrial interpretation of ancient evidence. The series format typically presents conventional archaeological and historical evidence, alongside alternative interpretations that emphasize unexplained aspects of ancient achievements, creating false equivalences between established scholarly consensus and speculative theories lacking empirical support. This presentation strategy appeals to audiences skeptical of academic authority, while satisfying entertainment preferences for dramatic narratives that promise revolutionary revelations about human history and cosmic significance. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary literature and speculative fiction extends far beyond ancient astronaut theories through their incorporation into fantasy and science fiction narratives that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian mythology while adapting these concepts to serve modern storytelling purposes. Authors like Neil Gaiman in American Gods and Kim Stanley Robinson in The Years of Rice and Salt have incorporated Mesopotamian deities into complex narratives, exploring themes of cultural change, religious evolution, and human adaptation to technological advancement. The video game industry has particularly embraced Mesopotamian mythological concepts through games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization that allow players to interact with historical civilizations while incorporating fantastical elements derived from ancient religious traditions. These interactive media create immersive experiences that introduce players to Mesopotamian cultural concepts while transforming them into entertainment content that may bear little resemblance to their original historical contexts. Contemporary neo-pagan and reconstructionist religious movements have attempted to revive authentic Mesopotamian religious practices through careful study of cuneiform sources and archaeological evidence, creating modern religious communities that honor traditional Anunnaki while adapting ancient practices to contemporary social and legal contexts. The Mesopotamian reconstructionist movement, though relatively small, includes practitioners who have learned cuneiform script, studied ancient ritual procedures, and created modern adaptations of traditional ceremonies that maintain theological continuity with ancient practices. These contemporary practitioners face significant challenges in reconstructing authentic ancient religious practices from incomplete textual and archaeological sources, while also adapting traditions developed for ancient urban temple communities to serve the needs of modern individuals and small groups. The absence of continuous traditional transmission requires modern practitioners to rely on scholarly interpretations of ancient sources, creating religious practices that may differ substantially from their ancient predecessors. Despite sincere attempts at historical accuracy, the Sumerian Mesopotamian Orthodox Temple movement, established by practitioners seeking to create authentic reconstructions of ancient religious traditions, has developed ritual practices based on careful study of cuneiform liturgical texts and archaeological evidence for temple procedures. These groups typically emphasize historical accuracy over contemporary spiritual needs, creating religious practices that prioritize authenticity to ancient sources, even when this creates practical difficulties for modern practitioners. Other contemporary groups have adopted more flexible approaches that honor Mesopotamian deities while incorporating modern spiritual concepts and practices that address contemporary religious needs. These syncretic movements may combine Anunnaki worship with elements from other ancient traditions, modern witchcraft practices, or New Age spirituality, creating religious systems that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian sources while serving the spiritual needs of modern practitioners. The academic study of these contemporary religious movements has revealed the complex relationship between historical scholarship and modern spiritual practice, with Reconstructionist groups serving as both consumers and critics of academic research on ancient Mesopotamian religion. These practitioners often possess sophisticated knowledge of cuneiform sources and archaeological evidence that enables them to engage critically with scholarly interpretations while developing their own understanding of ancient religious concepts and practices. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary culture extends beyond explicit religious or alternative history movements through their incorporation into broader cultural narratives about human origins, technological development, and cosmic significance. The themes of divine creation, technological advancement, and moral judgment that characterize Mesopotamian mythology continue to resonate with modern audiences through their appearance in science fiction, fantasy literature, and popular philosophy that addresses fundamental questions about human nature and destiny. The digital age has created new opportunities for preserving and disseminating knowledge about Anunnaki traditions through online databases, digital archives, and interactive educational resources that make cuneiform texts and archaeological evidence accessible to global audiences. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and the open, richly annotated cuneiform corpus provide scholars and interested individuals with access to thousands of primary sources that were previously available only to specialists with access to major research libraries. These digital resources have democratized access to Mesopotamian source materials while also creating new challenges for distinguishing between accurate, scholarly information and alternative interpretations that may lack empirical support. The Internet's capacity for rapid information dissemination has enabled both academic research and pseudoscientific theories to reach global audiences simultaneously, requiring users to develop critical evaluation skills for assessing the reliability of different sources and interpretations. The contemporary legacy of Anunnaki traditions thus encompasses multiple parallel streams of interpretation and application that serve different cultural functions within modern society. Academic scholarship continues to refine understanding of these deities' historical roles within ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while alternative theories provide entertainment and speculative frameworks for understanding human origins. Religious Reconstructionist movements attempt to revive authentic ancient practices, while popular culture adapts Mesopotamian concepts to serve contemporary storytelling and spiritual needs. The enduring appeal of Anunnaki concepts across these diverse contemporary applications demonstrates the fundamental importance of the questions that these ancient traditions addressed regarding cosmic order, divine authority, human purpose, and moral responsibility. Whether approached as historical phenomena worthy of scholarly investigation, extraterrestrial visitors offering solutions to cosmic mysteries, or divine beings deserving contemporary worship, the Anunnaki continue to provide frameworks for understanding humanity's place within larger cosmic and historical contexts. The scholarly consensus regarding Anunnaki as sophisticated theological concepts developed within the world's earliest urban civilizations provides the most reliable foundation for understanding their historical significance and continuing relevance. These deities represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand cosmic order, political authority, and moral responsibility through complex mythological narratives that integrated religious, political, and practical concerns within comprehensive worldviews that sustained urban civilization for over 3 millennia. The preservation of Anunnaki traditions through cuneiform literature and archaeological remains ensures that these ancient concepts will continue to influence human understanding of religious, political, and cultural development, regardless of how contemporary interpreters choose to understand their ultimate significance. The careful work of scholars who have recovered, translated, and interpreted these sources provides future generations with access to humanity's earliest systematic theological and philosophical thinking, demonstrating both the continuity and creativity that have characterized human intellectual development throughout recorded history. The Anunnaki's journey from active deities governing ancient Mesopotamian city-states to subjects of contemporary academic study, popular speculation, and religious revival illustrates the complex processes through which ancient cultural traditions adapt to serve new social and intellectual needs, while maintaining essential continuity with their historical origins. Their continuing presence in modern discourse, whether through scholarly analysis, alternative theories, or contemporary religious practice, testifies to the enduring power of the fundamental questions about human existence, cosmic order, and divine authority that these ancient traditions first systematically addressed over 5,000 years ago. The systematic recovery and interpretation of Mesopotamian sources throughout the 19th and 20th centuries established foundations for understanding these ancient traditions with unprecedented precision. Yet this scholarly achievement coexists uneasily with popular reinterpretations that transform historical religious phenomena into contemporary cultural products serving very different purposes than their original contexts intended. The tension between academic rigor and popular accessibility, between historical accuracy and narrative appeal, reveals fundamental questions about how societies engage with their cultural past. Modern Mesopotamian studies face challenges that extend beyond simple translation of dead languages or excavation of ancient sites. Every cuneiform tablet read, every temple excavated, every ritual reconstructed requires interpretive frameworks that inevitably reflect contemporary concerns alongside ancient realities. Scholars who devote careers to mastering Sumerian grammar or Akkadian literature bring their own cultural assumptions to texts written by authors whose worldviews differ fundamentally from modern perspectives. This hermeneutic circle cannot be escaped, only acknowledged and navigated with appropriate humility. The alternative theories that have captured popular imagination despite academic rejection demonstrate how cultural needs shape engagement with the past. Ancient astronaut hypotheses offer simple answers to complex questions about human origins and civilizational development. They promise hidden knowledge accessible to anyone willing to question established authorities. They connect ancient achievements to contemporary technological frameworks in ways that make distant civilizations seem relevant to modern concerns. These functions explain their persistence despite lacking empirical support. Religious reconstructionist movements pursuing authentic revival of Anunnaki worship face different challenges. They must reconstruct practices from fragmentary sources while adapting ancient traditions developed for urban temple communities to serve modern individuals and small groups. They navigate between historical accuracy and contemporary relevance, between preserving tradition and addressing current spiritual needs. Their efforts reveal both the resilience of ancient religious concepts and the difficulty of transplanting them across vast temporal and cultural distances. The scholarly community's relationship with these alternative interpretations has evolved from dismissive rejection toward more nuanced engagement that acknowledges the cultural work such theories perform. Academics increasingly recognize that simply declaring alternative theories wrong accomplishes little when those theories serve emotional and intellectual needs that conventional scholarship doesn't address. More productive approaches involve demonstrating why academic methods produce more reliable knowledge while acknowledging the limitations and uncertainties inherent in historical reconstruction. Digital technologies have transformed how Mesopotamian sources reach global audiences. Online databases provide unprecedented access to primary materials previously available only to specialists with institutional affiliations. Digital publications eliminate traditional barriers of geography and cost that restricted scholarly discourse. Social media platforms enable direct communication between academics and interested publics. These developments democratize knowledge while also enabling rapid spread of misinformation that lacks peer review or quality control. The challenge facing Mesopotamian studies involves maintaining rigorous scholarly standards while making ancient civilizations accessible and relevant to contemporary audiences. This requires clear communication about what evidence supports, what remains uncertain, and why particular interpretive methods prove more reliable than alternatives. It demands engaging with popular culture and alternative theories rather than dismissing them, using such engagement as opportunities for education about historical methods and ancient contexts. Future developments in archaeological techniques, computational analysis, and interdisciplinary collaboration will continue refining understanding of Anunnaki traditions and their historical contexts. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery identify sites for excavation with minimal environmental impact. Machine learning algorithms assist with tablet reconstruction and translation. Climate science illuminates environmental contexts that shaped ancient decisions. Genetic analysis traces population movements that influenced cultural development. These technological advances generate unprecedented quantities of data requiring new interpretive frameworks. Yet no amount of technical sophistication eliminates the fundamental challenge of understanding ancient minds through material remains and textual fragments. Mesopotamian sources reveal what temple administrators thought worth recording, what royal scribes wanted posterity to remember, what circumstances of preservation allowed to survive. They systematically exclude perspectives of farmers, slaves, women, and countless others whose lives sustained the civilizations that generated written sources. Any reconstruction of Anunnaki worship necessarily privileges elite male perspectives while struggling to recover alternative viewpoints. The theological sophistication evident in Mesopotamian religious texts deserves recognition alongside their historical and cultural significance. These compositions address fundamental questions about existence, suffering, justice, and meaning through mythological narratives that retain power despite their ancient origins. The Atrahasis epic's exploration of divine human relationships, the Enuma Elish's meditation on order and chaos, the Gilgamesh epic's confrontation with mortality, these works engage philosophical and existential concerns that transcend their particular cultural contexts. Modern readers approaching these texts must resist dual temptations. One involves dismissing ancient religious concepts as primitive superstitions superseded by more sophisticated modern understanding. The other treats ancient texts as repositories of lost wisdom superior to contemporary knowledge. Both approaches fail to engage seriously with how Mesopotamian thinkers addressed questions that remain genuinely difficult, using intellectual tools appropriate to their context while achieving insights that sometimes surpass modern conventional wisdom. The transformation of Anunnaki from active deities to historical subjects represents broader patterns in how modernity engages with religious traditions. Secularization doesn't eliminate religious concepts, but transforms their social functions and cultural meanings. Ancient deities become objects of academic study, sources of artistic inspiration, vehicles for alternative historical speculation, or focuses for religious reconstruction. Each transformation preserves something while losing something else, creating new possibilities while foreclosing others. Mesopotamian civilization's collapse didn't erase its influences on subsequent cultures. Legal traditions, astronomical knowledge, mathematical techniques, literary forms, and religious concepts that originated in ancient Mesopotamia continued shaping human civilization through complex transmission processes involving multiple intermediaries and repeated reinterpretations. The 7-day week, zodiacal astrology, base 60 number systems, and flood narratives represent obvious continuities. Less visible but equally significant influences appear in political ideologies, theological concepts, and philosophical frameworks that trace ancestry to Mesopotamian precedents through winding paths of cultural transmission. Understanding these transmission processes requires tracing how concepts moved between cultures, transformed through translation and reinterpretation, adapted to new contexts while maintaining recognizable connections to their origins. Jewish communities in Babylonian exile adapted Mesopotamian literary forms and mythological themes to serve monotheistic theology. Greek scholars incorporated Babylonian astronomical observations and mathematical techniques while developing different theoretical frameworks. Islamic scholars preserved and extended Mesopotamian scientific knowledge while transforming its cultural contexts. Each transmission involved selection, modification, and reinterpretation that both preserved and transformed original concepts. The question of what makes Mesopotamian civilization foundational for subsequent human development admits multiple answers depending on what aspects one emphasizes. Urban planning, writing systems, legal codes, and administrative bureaucracies represent obvious practical contributions. Literary forms, religious concepts, and philosophical frameworks constitute less tangible but equally significant influences. Perhaps most fundamentally, Mesopotamian civilization demonstrated that humans could create complex societies sustained by specialized labor, coordinated through institutional structures, and justified by comprehensive ideological systems. This demonstration made subsequent civilizations possible by providing models and precedents they could adapt to their particular circumstances. Yet acknowledging Mesopotamian priority doesn't require accepting narratives of linear progress from primitive origins to sophisticated modernity. Mesopotamian achievements in mathematics, astronomy, literature, and political organization sometimes surpassed those of supposedly more advanced, later civilizations. Their failures in creating sustainable political systems or equitable social structures parallel failures that continue plaguing contemporary societies. The relationship between ancient and modern involves complex patterns of continuity, transformation, loss and recovery, rather than simple progress from inferior to superior states. The Anunnaki traditions specifically demonstrate how religious concepts serve multiple functions simultaneously. They provided theological explanations for natural phenomena and human experiences. They justified political structures and social hierarchies. They offered frameworks for understanding suffering, injustice, and mortality. They created community identity and cultural continuity. They generated economic activity through temple institutions. Any adequate understanding must acknowledge this multifunctionality rather than reducing ancient religion to single purposes like social control or primitive science. Contemporary engagements with Anunnaki concepts, whether through academic scholarship, alternative theories, or religious reconstruction, necessarily reflect modern concerns and contexts. Scholars asking questions about gender relations, environmental sustainability, or political legitimacy in ancient Mesopotamia bring contemporary perspectives to historical sources. Alternative theorists emphasizing ancient technology or extraterrestrial contact project modern fascinations onto ancient texts. Religious practitioners adapting ancient rituals to contemporary contexts create new traditions inspired by but distinct from their historical precedents. This presentism cannot be eliminated, only acknowledged and managed through self-conscious reflection on how contemporary contexts shape historics. Interpretation. The fragility of cultural transmission, evident in Mesopotamian history, offers sobering perspectives on civilizational continuity. Cuneiform literacy disappeared so completely that decipherment required 19th century linguistic breakthroughs. Temple institutions that had sustained religious traditions for millennia collapsed relatively quickly once their economic and political supports eroded. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge preserved through centuries of observation could be lost within generations when institutional frameworks maintaining scholarly traditions dissolved. This fragility suggests that cultural achievements cannot be taken for granted. but require active maintenance through institutions, practices, and commitments that sustain their transmission across generations. Modern technological civilization's unprecedented power to both preserve and destroy cultural heritage creates responsibilities that previous generations didn't face. Digital archives can preserve texts more securely than clay tablets, but depend on technological infrastructures requiring constant maintenance. Climate change threatens archaeological sites that survived millennia of human habitation. Political instability enables destruction of cultural heritage for ideological purposes, as seen in recent deliberate demolition of ancient Mesopotamian sites. The capacity to document and preserve competes with capacities to neglect and destroy, making cultural heritage preservation an ethical imperative rather than automatic outcome of technological progress. The questions that Mesopotamian thinkers addressed through Anunnaki theology remain genuinely open despite millennia of subsequent philosophical and theological development. How should political authority be organized and legitimized? What obligations do individuals owe to communities, and vice versa? How can societies balance stability with adaptability? What gives life meaning in the face of inevitable death? How should humans relate to natural forces beyond their control? Contemporary answers to these questions differ from Mesopotamian responses, but the questions themselves retain urgency that transcends particular cultural contexts. Engaging seriously with ancient Mesopotamian civilization requires intellectual humility about both ancient achievements and modern understanding. The sophistication evident in Mesopotamian mathematics, astronomy, literature, and political organization demands respect and careful study. Yet modern knowledge about historical contexts, comparative civilizations, and human psychology enables insights unavailable to ancient thinkers themselves. Neither ancient wisdom nor modern expertise provides complete understanding, but their combination through disciplined historical scholarship offers the most reliable path toward comprehending these remarkable human achievements. The Anunnaki's transformation from divine rulers to historical subjects to contemporary cultural symbols illustrates how human societies continuously reinterpret their pasts to serve present needs. This process involves neither simple preservation nor complete invention, but complex interactions between inherited traditions and contemporary concerns that transform both. Understanding these interactions requires acknowledging that all engagement with the past occurs in present contexts, serving present purposes, reflecting present values. Historical knowledge never achieves pure objectivity, but disciplined methods and self-conscious reflection can distinguish more reliable from less reliable interpretations. The enduring fascination that Mesopotamian civilization exerts on modern imagination reflects more than antiquarian curiosity about humanity's earliest urban societies. These ancient cities and their divine patrons represent foundational experiments in how humans organize themselves, understand their world, and create meaning from existence. Their successes and failures, preserved in archaeological remains and cuneiform texts, offer perspectives on perennial human challenges that retain relevance despite vast changes in material circumstances and cultural contexts. Studying Mesopotamian civilization means studying ourselves, recognizing both continuities and transformations across 5 millennia of human development. The complexity of Mesopotamian religious thought, evident in texts ranging from temple hymns to creation epics to ritual procedures, demonstrates that ancient peoples were sophisticated thinkers addressing difficult questions with intellectual tools appropriate to their contexts. Dismissing their conclusions as primitive superstition misses opportunities to learn from their insights. Accepting their conclusions as superior wisdom ignores the limitations of their knowledge. Engaging seriously with their thinking as legitimate attempts to understand reality using available resources offers the most productive approach, treating ancient thinkers as intellectual partners across temporal distances, rather than as either primitive predecessors or enlightened ancestors. The future of Mesopotamian studies depends on maintaining scholarly rigor while making ancient civilizations accessible to broader audiences. This requires clear communication about what evidence supports, honest acknowledgement of uncertainties, and patient explanation of why particular methods prove more reliable than alternatives. It demands engagement with popular culture and alternative theories as opportunities for education rather than threats to be dismissed. It necessitates self-conscious reflection on how contemporary contexts shape historical interpretation. It requires commitment to preserving and studying the material remains that make knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia possible. The Anunnaki, whether understood as historical religious phenomena, extraterrestrial visitors, or contemporary spiritual focuses, continue providing frameworks through which humans explore fundamental questions about existence, authority, purpose, and meaning. Their persistence across diverse interpretive contexts testifies to the power of the questions they addressed and the flexibility of the mythological narratives through which those questions were explored. Understanding these ancient traditions in their historical contexts enriches contemporary engagements with them, whether through scholarship, speculation, or worship, by revealing the complex processes through which human cultures create, transmit, and transform their most fundamental beliefs about reality. The rivers that gave birth to Mesopotamian civilization continue flowing through landscapes that have witnessed 5 millennia of human history. The cities that once dominated these plains lie buried beneath tells marking human occupation, spanning countless generations. The cuneiform tablets that preserved ancient thoughts wait in museums and archives for scholars to unlock their meanings. The questions that drove Mesopotamian thinkers to create their sophisticated theological systems remain relevant as humans continue grappling with existence's fundamental mysteries. This continuity across vast temporal distances reminds us that understanding the past enriches the present while preparing for futures whose contours we can barely imagine.